For decades, we were told this was the origin story of the English countryside. Pale skin, fair hair, a people shaped by gray skies and weak sun, evolving generation after generation into the pallid, freckled archetype we now call typically British. It's an image so deeply embedded in the culture that it feels less like a theory and more like common sense. Of course, the first Britons were pale. Look at the weather. Then, in a laboratory in London, scientists drilled a 2-millimeter hole into the skull of a man who had been dead for 10,000 years. And what came out of that hole rewrote the assumption entirely. In 1903, workers digging in Gough's Cave in the limestone gorge of Cheddar, Somerset, uncovered a skeleton. It was remarkably complete for its age, and its age was almost unthinkable. Roughly 10,000 years old, dating to the Mesolithic period, thousands of years before farming, before writing, before anything resembling the Britain we would recognize today. He became known, inevitably, as Cheddar Man. For over a century, he sat in the collection of London's Natural History Museum as a curiosity, a skeleton without a face. When artists eventually attempted to reconstruct his appearance using traditional forensic methods, working only from bone structure, they did what most reconstructions of ancient Europeans did at the time. They gave him pale skin, light eyes in a generic sense, an appearance that slotted comfortably into the assumed lineage of the modern British population. It made a kind of intuitive sense. Britain is a northern island. Northern latitudes mean less sunlight. Less sunlight, evolutionary biology tells us, favors lighter skin, which absorbs more ultraviolet radiation to produce vitamin D. Cheddar Man, the story went, must have already been on that path. A distant, weathered ancestor of the modern Englishman, pale and blue-eyed by necessity. It was a clean explanation. It fit the landscape, it fit the climate, and it fit an unspoken cultural expectation about what ancient British was supposed to look like. Cheddar Man became a minor celebrity of British prehistory, referenced in textbooks, displayed at the Natural History Museum in London, occasionally trotted out in news stories about the deep roots of the nation. In a study conducted decades earlier, researchers had even identified a living resident of the nearby village, a history teacher, as a direct maternal line descendant, a detail that only deepened the sense that Cheddar Man belonged to a clean, continuous, recognizably British story stretching back 10,000 years. Nobody had the tools to seriously test what he actually looked like. Until now. Here is the problem the assumption never had to answer. Skin color is not a slow, linear response to latitude that arrives the moment humans set foot somewhere colder. It is a genetic trait governed by specific, identifiable genes, and those genes change frequency in a population only through selection pressure, acting across many generations, or through the arrival of new people carrying different versions of those genes entirely. Cheddar Man's ancestors had migrated into Europe from Africa via the Near East only tens of thousands of years earlier, following the retreat of Ice Age glaciers. 10,000 years is a long time by human standards. It is a comparatively short window in evolutionary terms, especially for a trait as genetically specific as skin pigmentation, which in modern Europeans is largely controlled by a small handful of genes, including variants at SLC24A5 and SLC45A2, that took thousands of additional years to spread to fixation across the population. So, the real question researchers at the Natural History Museum and University College London quietly began asking themselves was not, what did Cheddar Man look like? It was more unsettling than that. Had anyone actually checked, or had a comforting assumption simply been repeated so many times it calcified into fact? In 2018, a joint team from the Natural History Museum and UCL set out to answer the question properly. The challenge was extraction. DNA degrades over time, and Britain's damp climate is not kind to ancient genetic material. The team's ancient DNA specialists, including Selena Brace, targeted the petrous bone, the dense, protective bone at the base of the skull surrounding the inner ear, which preserves DNA far better than almost any other part of the human skeleton. They drilled a small hole, extracted bone powder, and for the first time in over a century, sequenced Cheddar Man's full genome. The data that came back went to specialists in ancient pigmentation genetics, who cross-referenced his genetic markers against genes already known, from decades of modern and ancient genomic research, to correlate strongly with skin tone, eye color, and hair color. The process is probabilistic rather than absolute. It doesn't produce a photograph. It produces a set of genetic markers that, mapped against large modern datasets, predict physical traits with a documented degree of confidence. Researchers were careful to frame it exactly that way. Not certainty, but strong likelihood, built from the same techniques increasingly used in forensic science today. The team worked alongside paleoartists Alphonse and Adri Kennis, twin brothers renowned for reconstructing prehistoric faces with forensic precision, feeding the genetic predictions directly into a three-dimensional scan of the original skull. Layer by layer, muscle depth by muscle depth, a face began to take shape that had never existed in any museum display before, built not from assumption, but from sequence data pulled out of a bone that had waited underground, then in a storage drawer, for 10,000 years. And the prediction that emerged was not what anyone expected. Cheddar Man, the genetic data indicated, likely had dark to black skin, dark curly hair, and strikingly blue eyes. Not the pale ancestor of English folklore, not a transitional figure already halfway toward the modern Northern European complexion. A hunter-gatherer whose skin tone would today be described as dark, paired with an eye color usually associated in the popular imagination with fair-skinned populations. Natural History Museum research lead Chris Stringer called the combination genuinely surprising, a pairing that didn't fit the tidy narrative anyone had assumed. The finding wasn't an isolated fluke, either. When compared against other Mesolithic genomes recovered from sites across the European continent, in Spain, Hungary, and Luxembourg, the pattern repeated. Dark skin paired with light-colored eyes shows up again and again in hunter-gatherer populations across Ice Age and post-Ice Age Europe. Cheddar Man wasn't an exception. He was representative of an entire chapter of European history that had simply never been visualized correctly. The team commissioned a new facial reconstruction, built by paleo artists using the genetic data alongside the original skull scans. The resulting model, unveiled publicly, showed a face utterly unlike the version that had stood in for ancient Britain for generations. To understand why this happened, you have to follow the deeper timeline. Cheddar Man's ancestors were part of a wave of hunter-gatherers who moved into Western Europe roughly 11,000 years ago as the last ice age loosened its grip and land bridges and coastlines shifted. These populations carried genetic variants for darker pigmentation, likely retained from earlier ancestral populations, because there had simply not yet been enough evolutionary time or enough selective pressure to shift those genes toward the paler variants we associate with the region today. Lighter skin in Northern Europe did not arrive gradually, quietly, generation by generation, as sunlight did its slow work. It arrived largely through migration. Genetic variants for paler skin appear to have spread into Britain significantly later, arriving with populations moving in from further east and from the Middle East, associated with the transition to farming roughly 6,000 years ago, and later still with subsequent migrations during the Bronze Age. In other words, the pale British ancestor wasn't a slow local adaptation. It was, in large part, an entirely different population that arrived afterward, carrying entirely different genes, and gradually became numerically dominant. Cheddar Man's population, the deep hunter-gatherer lineage of Mesolithic Britain, was substantially replaced not simply repainted by sunlight over the centuries. When the findings went public, the reaction went well beyond academic circles. Headlines seized on the phrase, "Cheddar Man had dark skin," and the story became, briefly, a flashpoint in a much larger public conversation about identity, ancestry, and what it means to belong to a place. That reaction is worth sitting with carefully because the genetic findings themselves don't make sweeping claims about modern identity. They describe one ancient individual and a broader Mesolithic population, not a verdict on any living community today. What the data does responsibly demonstrate is something quieter but arguably more important, that categories like white and the native population of Britain are not fixed biological facts stretching back into deep time. They are relatively recent social and historical constructs layered on top of a much messier, much more mixed genetic history than the folklore ever allowed for. The unease some viewers felt wasn't really about Cheddar Man. It was about realizing how much of who we've always been is actually who we started saying we were, at some specific and much more recent point in time. Some commentators pushed back hard, arguing the reconstruction was speculative theater dressed up as science. The researchers themselves were candid about the uncertainty built into pigmentation prediction, noting explicitly that these were probabilistic estimates, not photographs. But the underlying genetic data itself, the actual DNA sequence pulled from that petrous bone, was never in dispute. What was being contested, really, wasn't the science. It was what the science implied about a story people had grown attached to. Roughly 10% of indigenous British ancestry today can still be genetically traced back to the hunter-gatherer population Cheddar Man belonged to, a faint but persistent thread running through thousands of years of subsequent migration, farming, and further population turnover, including later arrivals connected to Bronze Age steppe migrations that reshaped the British gene pool yet again. Modern Britain, in other words, isn't the product of one people quietly adapting in place across 10 millennia. It is the accumulated residue of multiple, distinct waves of people, arriving, mixing, and in some cases nearly replacing what came before, each layer leaving behind a genetic signature that DNA analysis can now, for the first time, actually read. Cheddar Man is not an ancestor in the simple, singular sense the word implies. He's a fragment, a data point from one of several foundational layers, most of which were, until very recently, invisible to us entirely. There is something quietly humbling in what a 2-millimeter hole in a 10,000-year-old skull revealed. Not a hidden conspiracy, not an erased truth deliberately hidden by anyone, but something more human than that. An assumption, repeated often enough across generations of textbooks and museum displays until it simply felt obvious. And obvious things are rarely checked. Cheddar Man's face, reconstructed at last from the actual genetic record rather than inherited expectation, doesn't just correct a single museum display. It quietly dismantles the idea that identity is something ancient, fixed, and singular, handed down unchanged from some pure point of origin. The truth the DNA tells is less tidy and more interesting. Identity, even something as seemingly rooted as national ancestry, is a layered, shifting accumulation of arrivals, admixtures, and replacements, most of them lost to written history, all of them recoverable, it turns out, in a strand of ancient DNA. History isn't written only in books. Sometimes it's written in a single, 10,000-year-old bone, waiting patiently for someone to finally ask the right question.